Hello, and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake up a cocktail or other mixed drink, have a sip, and then talk a bit about how it is, its history, some variants, etc. We're continuing our quest to work through the IBA's official list of cocktails to see how those stack up. We're in the second section, the contemporary classics, and it's been really nice here the past week or so, and today is overcast and intermittently rainy, so I thought we'd brighten things up with this week's contemporary classic, the Margarita. Now, I don't think I need to tell anyone what a margarita is. I think it definitely belongs on a list of the contemporary classics. Pretty much everyone who drinks alcoholic beverages has tried a margarita before. So this one definitely deserves its place. It's a drink I quite like. I quite like tequila. I quite like limes. So what's not to like? Little bit of a contentious history on this one. And I'll tell you before we begin it, we don't know the answer, and I think probably the answer is kind of unknowable, because I think there's probably multiple true stories that sort of blended themselves together into the drink we have today. So the most interesting to me, and sort of the oldest story, has the drink created kind of by accident. And so I'd like to read first from our favorite tome, Imbibe. You thought last week after I pulled out Smuggler's Cove we were done with Imbibe. We're not. It still has relevance to us. So I'm going to read just a brief passage from this. I guess I should give a slight bit of information first. We've discussed daisies before. We've never done an episode on them, but they've come up in history and connections to other drinks. And a daisy basically is a sour that typically had a little bit of seltzer added to it and either replaced the sweetener or split the sweetener with some sort of liqueur, generally orange curacao, triple sec, that sort of thing. Daisies were really, really popular for a minute, 1870s, 1880s. Then they sort of evolved into a more complicated drink with grenadine or raspberries in them and some other ingredients. They sort of went through a similar process to cocktails in general, how we went to improved and fancies and so on. The same sort of thing happened in daisies, but they just continued being called daisies. Okay, with that out of the way, I'm going to read a whole paragraph of Imbibe here. I'm going to skip through parts of it. So, a paraphrase of David Wondrich's Imbibe. A little after repeal, journalists and other travelers who visited Mexico started talking about a tequila daisy, and in 1936, this even pops up north of the border, in Syracuse, New York, of all places. Unfortunately, nobody bothers to record which type of daisy they're drinking. The old school one, which was often served in cocktail glasses with only a minimal amount of fizz, or the new school one, such as the Sunrise, who we just talked about for the beginning of the paragraph. This is important because of the Spanish word for daisy. If they were drinking them old school, you see, they were drinking tequila, orange liqueur, lime juice, much more common than lemon in Mexico, and maybe a little splash of soda, and ordering them as margaritas. Because margarita, of course, is Spanish for daisy. So, this is interesting. There were definitely drinks called tequila daisies in at least the 1930s. There's some reports of them back to the 1920s. No one wrote down what the recipes for any of these drinks are, but as Wondrich points out, if they were old school, sort of traditional daisies, they were what we know as a margarita today, with maybe a little bit of soda water added, maybe a bar spoon of sugar added, but otherwise our modern margarita. So it'd be easy to say that's definitely the answer. There's a lot of other stories for where it came from. Most of them I don't think are true at all, and I'm not going to go through all of them. There's literally a dozen or more bars in Mexico, in Southern California, in Southern Texas, that all claim to have invented the drink, with various stories behind them. I'm only going to tell sort of 1.5 of those, because they are relevant. So one of them, and the exact details don't matter because this didn't happen, but a lady named Margaret was at this bar in maybe Tijuana, maybe somewhere else, and she ordered a Magnolia, which is a drink that I don't think we'll ever cover. The bartender couldn't remember how to make a Magnolia, and rather than consult a bar manual or let the customer know that he didn't know how to make one, he decided to wing it. All he could remember is, I think Magnolias have triple sec in them. And then he just made up a drink, which apparently is our modern margarita. And he served it to her, and she said, well, that certainly isn't a Magnolia, but I like it. What do you call it? And he thinking about the fact that Magnolia is a type of flower and that Margarita means daisy and is a type of flower, named it the Margarita. Now, what's interesting about this story is at least 3 of the other stories also involve a woman named Margaret. And in all of those stories, that's the origin of the name. Margarita is the Spanish form of Margaret. So that makes sense. In this story, her name just happens to be Margaret, which is a great little coincidence there. And part of the reason why I don't think it's true. There's also a bar in Los Angeles called Tail of the Cock. Or I think it's a restaurant actually, but they had a thriving bar there. And apparently this bar was famous for some sort of tequila drink. And apparently this drink came into being when the head bartender there, Johnny Durlesser, I believe is his name, was approached in 1937 by the account manager at Young's Market Company, who was repping Jose Cuervo, and asked him to create a drink. And so he created this drink for Jose Cuervo, which they then used in their advertising, and which also became like the most popular drink at Tail of the Cock. This story isn't true either. But again, there's a reason why I'm telling it, because it ties into something a little bit. So it's definitely not true, because Tail of the Cock wasn't open in 1937. It didn't open until 1939. So that part's just untrue. But here's why these 3 sort of bits are interesting. It's definitely true that Young's Market ran a very successful campaign for Jose Cuervo, using the Margarita as its recipe. The ratio's a little different, but that was the drink. And that was very important for them, sold a ton of Cuervo for them, and that was sort of their flagship spirit at the time. Also, that bar, Tail of the Cock, did have a tequila-based drink that for many years was their best-selling item. We don't have the recipe, and we know that originally it didn't have a title, but at least not one that we know today, but that was their specialty. Also, we know that the Young's Market guy did go to that bar. Also, the exact Margaret in the story from the Mexico thing about the Magnolia and whatever else, she was good friends with the owner of Tail of the Cock. So, I don't really think any part of that story is where it came from, but there's enough sort of circling that story that clearly some part of that was involved with popularizing the drink, or spreading it, or the modern proportions, or there's too many variables there for it to just be nothing. And that bartender Johnny Durlesser was like a known figure. Like the fact that the story stuck to him for a while also lends it a bit of credibility. So I don't really know what happened. My best guess is that things like this drink, variants on both daisies and sours, were made with tequila, starting in at least the 1920s, continuing into a lot of these stories are set in the 40s and 50s. I think that where that name actually stuck from could be a number of places. I think that those early 1930s or earlier drinks were in fact essentially modern margaritas called margaritas, but I'm not sure that they are where that spread from. I think there might be some weird coincidence where that name popped up somewhere else for other reasons as well. So, sorry I don't have a more clear story, but those are some of the fun facts behind it. I can also say that even though Young's Market, which today is basically the West Coast division of RNDC, we're not going to be using any Jose Cuervo today. We're going to be making 3 different versions of the drink. We're going to do one exactly following the IBA spec. We're going to do one that's just different in a number of ways, and both uses some different extraction methods. We'll use a different tequila, and also we're going to add in a little bit of sweetness, both because a lot of people like it, and B, in several of these stories and pathways to the drink, it seems clear that the drink may have started as a sour, not as a daisy, so it definitely would have had simple in it or some other sweetness element. So we'll make one that way, and then finally we'll make one with mezcal, because I love mezcal. Let's get to the first one. Alright, so for the IBA version, we're going to follow their proportions exactly, which are a little bit odd. I think most common proportions on this drink are something like 2-1-1 in terms of spirit to liqueur to wine. IBA has it at 5.2 1.5, or I guess you could 10 4 3, which is a little weird, and it's also a little bit small. I think that generally you're going to have at least 2 ounces, 60 milliliters of tequila in a margarita, but that's not what the IBA calls for, so that's fine. We're going to start with our lime juice. We've got 15 milliliters of our lime juice. Then for our triple sec, Cointreau is definitely standard. It is called for in most of the 40s, 50s, 60s recipes. Also common is Grand Marnier. We've talked about before why my Grand Marnier is in these tiny little bottles. Doesn't matter. I don't necessarily prefer the Grand Marnier in the drink. I will say there's a weird trend at bars to have Grand Marnier be the premium option. And so a lot of times, especially in these sort of lower premium versions of a margarita, you'll see Grand Marnier in there instead of triple sec. I'm not entirely sure why, but I'm going to actually do that because I'm basically recreating a margarita that I've had at a restaurant a number of times. So I realize this isn't quite following the IBA spec, but Grand Marnier, if you're not familiar, is basically triple sec that uses cognac as a base instead of a more neutral spirit. We want 20 milliliters, about 2/3 of a fluid ounce. And then finally we're going to use El Jimador Reposado. This is about the cheapest real tequila you can buy. It's not bad, especially at its price point. And again, there's a specific restaurant I'm thinking of where their base margarita is some terrible Jose Cuervo unbranded triple sec and lime, and actually it's like a pre-mixed sour mix. But their first premium one is El Jimador Reposado Grand Marnier. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do here. We're looking for 50 milliliters, or about 1 2/3 fluid ounces. All right, and then I'm just going to strain that into an ideally chilled Nick and Nora glass. Obviously, there is a common margarita glass, which is a coupe that has an extra little coupe bit to it. I don't have any of those. We are going to use a coupe in the next version so that we can have the optional salt rim, which I don't like as much on a Nick and Nora glass. And this one is volumetrically tiny, so works out perfectly for a Nick and Nora glass. So this is our IBA spec, other than swapping Grand Marnier for triple sec margarita. So I don't get a ton of nose. It all blends together pretty well. There's a citrus element, but the Grand Marnier, cognac, lime together, especially the tiny amount of lime, it's kind of lost. It smells good, but I get a little bit of tequila, a little bit of cognac, basically. Yeah, so that's not bad. It reminds me why I don't generally make these with Grand Marnier. That cognac element is just not really helpful. It's not bad, it's just, there's its own note of cognac that is sort of mid-high palate, just, hi, I'm cognac, and, well, thanks for coming, but I didn't really need you here. I also think I do personally like a hair of sugar in this, just because I feel like the tequila is so closed off without it. Maybe if I was using a really good tequila in this, be better, but I think it would work better with just the smallest hair of sugar added. But anyway, what am I getting on the palate? Front of palate is sour, but not incredibly so. It's just pleasantly tart. Rolls into some of the tequila, the kind of underlying sort of minty vegetal notes. Further back, I get that big cognac hit for no real reason. And then I get sort of the rest of the tequila and orange, slight alcohol, little bit of orange, sort of big overall flavor further back in the palate. And then there is just a lingering lime tart thing happening, which leaves it with a kind of crisp, bright feeling. Not at all bad. This is not the best margarita you can make, but if you were served this, you would have trouble finishing it. All right, for version 2, we're gonna just do everything a little bit differently. So this isn't anyone in specific's recipe. This also isn't exactly my recipe that I usually make either, but it's sort of a mixture of different folks' recipes and proportions that I think will be an interesting contrast to the drink we just had. So we're gonna start off, it seems the same, with about 15 milliliters of lime juice. There's just nothing in that lime. Okay, I'm up to my 15 milliliters and that lime still has more to give. So that tells us that this other half of the lime probably has in the neighborhood of 15 milliliters in it as well. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to quarter it. Throw it into our shaker tin. Now, there's good and bad reasons to do this. First, I'm going to add about half a bar spoon of Demerara. And that's for 2 reasons. 1, it's to sweeten it. 2, we are going to muddle our limes a bit. And we're using both the muddler and some of those bits of Demerara to slightly score the zest. And so what we're doing is the same thing we would do when we express a twist, is we're releasing a bunch of oils. And the agitation when we shake it are also going to release more oils. So this part is the good idea. We're getting that really nice lime flavor, not just the tartness of the juice, but that really inherent lime oil flavor. The downside is there's a lot of pith that connects the segments of a lime and that are on the inner edge of the peel, and we're going to be agitating those and shaking those in alcohol as well. Pith is very bitter. So this can sort of work or not work depending very much on your taste, your limes, and your exact method. You can end up with a really limey, fun thing, or you can end up with a kind of bitter, unpleasant thing. So this is a controversial method, but we're going to try it and see. And then here we are going to switch to Cointreau. Now, since we added that half bar spoon of sugar, I'm going to use slightly less Cointreau than you'd think I might need. So I've added roughly 30 milliliters of lime juice between the 2 additions of lime juice. So if I'm following 2 to 1 to 1, I'm going to want 60 milliliters of the tequila. So I'd want 30 milliliters of this, except I already added sugar. So I'm going to put about 15 to 20 milliliters. Yeah, it's about 17 milliliters of our Cointreau. And now I'm going to use 60 milliliters or 2 ounces of tequila Blanco. This is Espolón, which I have talked about before, but I think this one is also a very good tequila for its price. Really like it. One other note on sweetener options. A lot of folks will tell you to use agave syrup, agave nectar, something like this, or if you dissolve this in some water, then it's a lot easier to work with. I agree flavor-wise, that's probably better than simple or Demerara. It doesn't let me do that cool muddling thing, and if you're just using it straight out of the bottle, it's really hard to combine. So try it if you want, or don't if you don't want. I'm gonna grab some ice and we'll shake. All right, and then we will strain that into an ideally chilled half-salt rimmed coupe. For the first one, double straining was, I don't think, entirely necessary. For this one, I would definitely recommend it if you're doing the bits of lime approach, as you will almost always end up with some pulp in there. And again, some people will put a lime wheel or a lime wedge or something in it. IBA doesn't call for it. I don't think it's really needed. But this is our version 2 of the Margarita. So, a lot brighter tequila notes. There is more tequila in this, and Espolón Blanco just is brighter. But there's a lot more sort of, if leather was a plant, it's sort of leathery, but really fresh. So more sweetness and more sourness, so more tartness. I've got a lime thing that runs through the entire drink now. Very front of the tongue is almost sour, goes back, gets slightly sweeter, stays tart, and just stays there the entire time. Really pleasant. Sort of just a little ways in, the tequila shows up. It's a little bit grassy, it's a little bit sharp, and then it just sort of fades out again. And so it just runs through really nice. There's some sort of nonsense happening out my window. And it's good. I don't really get orange strongly as orange, but it's in that middle place somewhere with the tequila and shows up toward the back, I think, a little bit. There's a little bit of lime-orange togetherness. In general, just so much more lime. I'm not getting hardly any bitterness. There might be just a hair, like a third of the way through the palate, but it's not enough to bother me. Let me try it with a bit of the salt. It's fine. That was too much salt. I don't know. The salt really doesn't do anything for me. There are drinks I like salt in, and I'm not opposed to salt in this. I'd just add a dash or two of saline solution when you're shaking it and not deal with the rim thing, but to each their own. All right, for the final version, we're going to do a mezcal version here. We've got 30 milliliters, or about 1 fluid ounce. To that, I'm going to add 20 milliliters, or 2/3 of an ounce, of Cointreau. To that, I'm going to add a very small amount of my 2-to-1 simple, a little less than half a Barspoon. So literally a couple milliliters. And then instead of a tequila style of mezcal, we're using Vida Mezcal. Hopefully there's enough in here. If not, I think I have another bottle someplace. Well, I think there would have been enough, but I spilled some like a fool. So I don't have another bottle of regular Vida, but I've got, from the same company, one of their higher-end single village mezcals, which I'm going to use a little bit of to make up the difference. And be careful not to spill this one. We've got 60 milliliters, or 2 fluid ounces, of our mezcal. I'm going to grab some new ice and clean out that bit of lime, and we'll be right back. Margaritas can, of course, be served in a lot of different ways. There's frozen ones, which we're certainly not making. There's the traditional strained up version, and then it is often served on the rocks as well. Thought I'd do that for the final one. I also did a very light rim of tahini, trying to get into the spirit of the fun stuff on the rim thing. I don't know. I thought tahini would go well with the smoky mezcal. That's the idea. Mezcal margarita. A lot of smoke. And sweet. It smells like sweet smoke. that tahini actually goes kind of nice. So, what do I get? It's not lime aggressive, not nearly as limey as the last one. There is a citrus note, but it's less tart, it's less sour. It's more just, I can tell there's citrus, which goes up into a slightly sweeter place. I'm reading some of the orange for the first time, which is the same amount of Cointreau, so maybe that's something with the tequila or the mezcal going on. But I'm reading some orange mid-high palate, and then that beautiful smoke of the mezcal comes in, fills up the back of the palate. If I have the tahini, that actually is really tangy and adds just a hair of heat right in the middle of the tongue. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'd say that I'm reading the mezcal biggest as that big smoky finish, but there is a middle where some of the vegetal, slightly sweet mezcal notes are playing with that orange and doing a really fun thing. Well, thank you so much for coming along with us this week as we looked at a few different versions of the Margarita. This is a drink that I'm sure you've already had. If somehow you haven't, you should definitely try it. If you have had it before, I would advise you to make one, but I would advise you to make it differently. Doesn't matter how, just it's a simple drink. Use decent quality tequila. Doesn't have to be amazing, but it should be all agave. Use some sort of orange liqueur and play with the proportions. I just think it's a really interesting drink. I didn't really go into it in the history part, but proportions have swayed wildly over time. We talked about the IBAs at like a 10, I did the math earlier, 10-4-3. But like the early Cuervo ads I mentioned, those were 1-to-1-to-1. So very different drink. Lots of places make it even drier or other ways. So play with it. It's fun. You should have a margarita in your repertoire. Please visit the blog at shakingandsipping.com. We'll have a write-up on this and each other drink. Most weeks, the day after the video posts, we'll have IBA in real life, where we go to a local Seattle cocktail bar, see if they make it a lot, if they have variants, etc. We'll almost certainly do that this week. The way you'll know is checking back on the blog or following on Twitter at shaking_sipping. Please do all the YouTube stuff, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, etc. I would appreciate it. And I'll be back next week with the next drink from the IBA's list. Until then, happy sipping. Cheers.